It's a cold Christmas Eve. Jason walked into the office, snow crunching under his shoes, his coat dusted with frost. The office lights were bright, cheerful, and cruel. Everyone else was leaving early, laughing, exchanging gifts, but he had one last meeting scheduled with Mark, his boss. He was nervous but hopeful. After all, he had closed the biggest client deal of the year. Maybe this was the moment Mark would finally acknowledge his work. Mark's office door opened, and there he was, smirking. "Jason," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I've been meaning to talk to you. You've underperformed this year." Jason blinked. Underperformed? He felt his stomach tighten. "Sir, I just closed the Reynolds account. That saved us nearly $1 million. Mark waved a hand dismissively. "It doesn't matter. You're let go. Effective immediately." Time seemed to stop. Jason's hands shook, his chest ached, and the hum of the office suddenly felt suffocating. The laughter in the hallway, the holiday music playing softly, it all felt like mockery. "On Christmas Eve," he managed to whisper. Mark didn't even flinch. "Merry Christmas," he said, handing over a pink slip. "Pack your things." Jason left the office, snow melting on his shoulders, humiliation burning hotter than the winter air. That night, he cried, not just for losing a job, but for the betrayal, the disrespect, the sheer injustice. He vowed silently, through tears and clenched fists, "One day, I'll make him regret this." Jason spent the next few weeks in a fog of anger and disbelief. Every morning, he'd wake up replaying that moment in Mark's office, the smug smile, the flick of the pink slip, the coldness in his voice. His friends told him to move on, to find another job, but he couldn't. It wasn't just about the money, it was about respect, dignity, and proving that Mark's cruelty didn't define him. He started small. Quietly, he updated his resume, reconnected with old colleagues, and studied the business world he had loved but never fully owned. Nights were spent in dimly lit cafes, laptop glowing, spreadsheets and articles scattered like battle plans. He observed Mark's company from afar, tracking deals, clients, weaknesses, even gossip that floated through industry circles. Jason felt the shift inside him. Where there was once confusion and hurt, there was focus and determination. "This isn't just about revenge," he muttered to himself one rainy evening. "It's about showing him that nothing he does can break me, and one day, I'll be the one holding the power." Every time he saw Mark in public events or industry functions, flaunting success and laughing at shallow jokes, Jason's resolve strengthened. He remembered every insult, every slight, every moment of being underestimated. And he began to plan, not impulsively, but strategically. He didn't just want Mark to feel regret, he wanted him to experience the crushing reality of losing control of the very thing he had once controlled so easily. Jason's plan began quietly, almost imperceptibly. He started attending industry networking events under the guise of a consultant, gathering contacts, and learning insider information about Mark's business moves. Every handshake, every casual conversation, every exchanged email was a piece of the puzzle he was constructing. At home, he filled notebooks with notes, Mark's clients, his investors, his public image, even his habits and favorite restaurants. Every detail mattered. Jason's apartment became a war room, papers pinned to walls, spreadsheets glowing on multiple monitors, maps of client territories spread across the floor. The hum of his laptop and the tick of the clock became his constant companions. Then came the first subtle strikes. Jason approached small investors quietly, hinting at potential collaborations outside of Mark's empire. He offered insight, strategy, and charm, just enough to pull loyalty without alerting Mark. Meanwhile, he monitored the company's moves, noting weaknesses Mark ignored or underestimated. Jason began to sleep less, eat less, and obsess more. Nights blurred into mornings as he strategized. He imagined the day he would finally confront Mark, not with fists, not with threats, but with undeniable power. He pictured Mark's face when the truth hit, that the man he had humiliated, ignored, and betrayed was now orchestrating the unraveling of everything Mark thought he owned. Every step was precise. Every conversation was a test. Every opportunity was a potential lever. Jason was no longer just a victim, he was becoming a force, silent, patient, and deadly in his precision. At the office events where Mark flaunted his success, Jason was always nearby, unseen but calculating. He smiled politely, shook hands, and remembered every slight, every insult, every moment of humiliation. And with every memory, his resolve strengthened. This wasn't just revenge. This was mastery. Jason's first major strike came quietly, under the radar. He identified a key client that Mark's company had relied on for years, one that was loyal only because Mark had handled them personally. Jason approached them with subtle charm, insight, and solutions tailored specifically to their needs. He didn't brag. He didn't threaten. He just presented an opportunity that Mark, in his arrogance, had overlooked. Meetings were arranged, proposals carefully crafted, and Jason ensured that every communication was professional, precise, and compelling. Meanwhile, Mark remained oblivious, too busy basking in the glow of superficial accolades and public appearances. He had no idea that Jason, the man he had dismissed so casually, was steadily chipping away at his empire. One afternoon, Jason received the call he had been waiting for. The client wanted to move part of their business over to Jason's influence. His pulse quickened, but he remained calm, controlling every word, every promise. Victory, at this stage, was a whisper, but it was thrilling nonetheless. As he walked home that evening, rain dripping from his hair, he allowed himself a small smile. Step 1 complete. He's blind. And that's going to be his biggest mistake. But Jason wasn't stopping there. He moved on to investors, planting seeds of doubt about Mark's management style, subtly hinting at inefficiencies and missed opportunities. Each meeting was a careful dance, every word was a weapon. At night, he'd lie awake, imagining Mark's reaction when he finally revealed the truth. The thought of Mark's smug face turning pale, of his confidence crumbling, fueled Jason's obsession. Every memory of humiliation, every sneer and insult, became a fuel that kept him awake for hours, planning the next move. Weeks turned into months. Jason's network expanded, his influence grew, and he learned the most powerful lesson of all: patience was a weapon far sharper than anger. Every step, every careful move, was bringing him closer to the moment when Mark would realize that everything he had taken for granted was slipping through his fingers, silently, invisibly, and inevitably. Mark started noticing small things first: an unusually quiet client here, a postponed deal there. At first, he shrugged them off, blaming the holiday slump or minor inefficiencies. But then came the emails, the subtle mentions from junior staff, the whispers at investor meetings. Something was off. He called a meeting, pacing in his glass-walled office, running a hand through his hair. Everything should be running perfectly, he muttered to his CFO. Why are we losing clients? Why are investors questioning decisions we've always made successfully? The CFO, nervous, avoided eye contact. I think some of our clients are exploring other options, sir. Nothing confirmed yet, but Mark's grin faltered. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of unease. Meanwhile, Jason was everywhere, but nowhere at once. Every client he had approached, every investor he had spoken to, was a deliberate move in a larger chess game. He wasn't just taking Mark's empire piece by piece, he was teaching him, silently, what it felt like to be powerless. Jason's apartment now looked like a war room on steroids. Maps, notes, spreadsheets, and contact lists covered every surface. Each day brought a new development, each evening a new step closer to ultimate control. One night, while reviewing client communications, Jason paused. He could almost hear Mark laughing at him in that office, that Christmas Eve. That memory made his jaw tighten and his resolve harden. Soon, he thought. Soon, he'll realize that the man he dismissed is the one running the show. Mark's world was starting to wobble. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were delayed. Deals slipped through his fingers, and he couldn't understand why. Panic began to edge into his confident exterior. Jason, on the other hand, moved with calm precision. Every smile, every polite handshake, every client pitch, was a calculated strike. And all the while, Mark remained oblivious, completely unaware that the man he had humiliated was orchestrating the collapse of everything he had taken for granted. Tension thickened with each passing day. Mark's arrogance had blinded him to one critical truth: patience and strategy could be more lethal than brute force, and Jason had mastered both. Jason knew the time was approaching. Months of meticulous planning, subtle manipulations, and strategic alliances were finally converging. Mark's confidence was cracking, his empire wobbling, and every misstep he made played perfectly into Jason's hands. Jason began reaching out to Mark's top investors directly. Meetings were discreet, under the pretense of consultations. He highlighted opportunities Mark had missed, projected potential profits under new leadership, and gently sowed seeds of doubt about Mark's judgment. Every gesture was calculated, never aggressive, always professional, but impossible to ignore. Simultaneously, Jason strengthened ties with key clients. He offered them solutions, loyalty programs, and personal attention Mark had grown too complacent to provide. Slowly, silently, the foundation of Mark's empire was shifting beneath him. One evening, Jason attended a gala where Mark was speaking. Mark was surrounded by colleagues, investors, and clients, laughing confidently as if nothing were amiss. Jason watched from a distance, calm and composed, his mind already calculating the final moves. He imagined the moment Mark would realize everything he had taken for granted: the control, the respect, the loyalty, was slipping away. Jason's phone buzzed. An email confirmation, one of Mark's largest clients had signed an exclusive contract with Jason's network. His pulse quickened, but his face remained neutral. This was the moment where patience paid off, the first visible crack in Mark's perfect facade. Back at Mark's office, panic was beginning to take root. Reports showed declining client retention. Investors were asking questions. The cracks were visible now, undeniable. Mark called emergency meetings, shouted at assistants, and demanded explanations, but nothing was working. Every effort he made to salvage the situation only accelerated the unraveling. Meanwhile, Jason's preparations for the ultimate move continued. Legal teams were briefed, financial transfers arranged, and every detail double-checked. He wasn't just going to take the company, he was going to do it in a way that Mark would never forget, ensuring that the humiliation was complete and unmistakable. The tension reached a fever pitch. Mark could feel something approaching, a storm he could neither predict nor control. And Jason? Jason felt nothing but calm, his focus absolute, his revenge nearly within reach. The day had finally arrived. Jason walked into Mark's office, carrying a thick folder that looked like any ordinary business proposal. Mark looked up, smiling smugly, unaware of the storm about to hit. "Jason," Mark said, leaning back in his chair, "I didn't expect to see you here today. Everything okay?" Jason placed the folder gently on the desk, his eyes calm, controlled. "Everything's more than okay," he said. "Actually, it's perfect." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Jason opened the folder, sliding the contract across the polished wood surface. "This," he said quietly, "is the final agreement. You've officially sold your company." Mark blinked. "Sold, my, what?" His voice caught, disbelief washing over him. This can't be happening." Jason smiled faintly, the satisfaction slow and deliberate. "Everything you've built, every client, every asset, every investor, it's mine now. 1 year ago, you laughed at me. You humiliated me. Today, the tables have turned." Mark's face turned pale. His confident posture collapsed into a slump of defeat. I don't understand, how?" Jason leaned back, calm, composed, triumphant. Patience. Strategy. And a little inevitability. The office was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. Mark's empire, once untouchable, was slipping through his fingers. Every slight he had thrown at Jason now returned 1,000-fold, a mirrored reflection of humiliation and loss. Jason closed the folder with a satisfying snap. Relief, triumph, and validation coursed through him. He had not only survived betrayal, he had transformed it into power. And Mark? Mark would never forget this day, nor the lesson it carried. As Jason walked out of the office, the winter sunlight hitting the glass facade, he felt a strange sense of peace. Revenge had been sweet, yes, but more than that, it had restored his dignity, his self-respect, and his belief in justice. Mark's confidence was slipping. Reports kept coming in, unexpected losses, client departures, and investors quietly expressing concerns. He tried to act normally, but the cracks in his empire were becoming too obvious to ignore. Panic whispered at the edges of his mind, though he refused to show it in front of his staff. Jason, meanwhile, continued his silent campaign. Every meeting, every conversation, every handshake was another calculated move. He wasn't just undermining Mark's authority, he was mapping out the exact moment when everything would collapse, and he would step in with precision. One evening, Mark slammed his office door behind him, pacing. "How is this happening? We've done everything right? Why are we losing control?" His assistant, hesitant and nervous, replied, "Sir, some clients, they're considering other options. And investors are asking questions we can't fully answer." Mark's face turned red. "I don't understand, we've been flawless. How could this happen?" Jason, from his hidden position at the same industry gala, watched Mark's frustration play out. Every flinch, every muttered curse, every sign of unease fueled Jason's resolve. The man who had humiliated him months ago had no idea that the cause of this unraveling was the very person he had dismissed. Jason knew the next moves had to be perfect. One wrong step, one hint of impatience, and the plan could fail. But the pressure only sharpened his focus. He began arranging secret meetings with key investors, planning subtle client shifts, and preparing legal maneuvers, all without leaving any trace that he was the architect behind Mark's growing despair. The tension was almost unbearable. Each day, Mark's desperation grew, while Jason's calm, controlled presence expanded his influence. The stage was being set. And soon, very soon, the moment of true confrontation would arrive. Jason's plan was entering its most delicate phase. Every move had to be precise, every word carefully chosen. He spent hours analyzing Mark's daily routines, reading between the lines of financial reports, and predicting how Mark would react to even the smallest shift in power. One morning, Jason received confirmation that a major client, one Mark had always considered untouchable, was ready to negotiate directly with him. His pulse raced, but he remained calm. Every gesture, every sentence, every email had to feel casual, harmless, invisible. Meanwhile, Mark was becoming increasingly paranoid. He questioned his employees constantly, demanded unnecessary meetings, and even started micromanaging projects he had never touched before. But the more he tried to regain control, the more he lost it. Every misstep amplified the cracks Jason had planted long ago. Jason began leveraging smaller alliances within the company, quietly gaining the trust of mid-level managers and key staff members who had grown frustrated with Mark's arrogance and favoritism. Each meeting, each casual conversation, subtly reinforced Jason's credibility and Mark's isolation. The psychological pressure on Mark was palpable. He felt it in every glance, every phone call that didn't go as expected, every unexpected client inquiry. Panic crept into his thoughts, though he refused to admit it out loud. Jason, watching from the sidelines, allowed himself a small, controlled smile. This wasn't about rushing or brute force, it was about strategy, patience, and letting Mark unravel on his own. And now, everything was coming together. The pieces were aligning, and the moment he had waited for, the moment when Mark would realize the true scope of what was happening, was just around the corner. Jason decided it was time to push harder. The groundwork had been laid, the alliances built, and Mark's overconfidence had left him blind. One by one, Jason began moving the key pieces that would tip the balance irreversibly in his favor. He scheduled meetings with major investors under the guise of strategic consultations. Each conversation was carefully constructed, highlighting opportunities Mark had ignored, subtly pointing out flaws in Mark's judgment, and demonstrating how Jason could manage the company more efficiently. The investors listened intently, intrigued by the clarity and insight Jason presented. At the same time, Jason strengthened ties with Mark's most loyal clients. Through personalized communication and meticulous attention, he offered them stability, reliability, and results, things Mark had taken for granted. Slowly, silently, the loyalty of Mark's empire was shifting without him noticing. Mark's behavior grew erratic. He yelled at assistants, demanded explanations from managers, and micromanaged every project in desperation. The cracks he had once ignored were now impossible to overlook. His confidence, once unshakable, was crumbling. Jason observed all of this from the sidelines, calm, collected, and focused. He could almost feel the tension radiating from Mark, smell the fear hidden beneath his forced bravado. Every step, every misstep by Mark, was a confirmation that patience and strategy were more powerful than raw anger. The final pieces were almost in place. One move away, and everything Mark had built would start to fall into Jason's hands. The anticipation was intoxicating. Jason allowed himself a brief, controlled smile, knowing that soon, all the humiliation, betrayal, and injustice he had endured would be reversed in the most satisfying way possible. The tension had reached a boiling point. Jason had everything in place, investors intrigued, clients shifting loyalty, and key staff quietly supporting him, but the final moves had to be precise. One wrong step, one hint of impatience, and the entire plan could unravel. Jason began coordinating a secret acquisition strategy. Through intermediaries and shell entities, he started quietly purchasing stakes in Mark's company. Every transaction was carefully structured to avoid detection, every move calculated to increase his control without alerting Mark. Meanwhile, Mark's panic was becoming visible. He stormed through the office, barking orders that went ignored or executed poorly. Calls from clients and investors went unanswered. He was losing control faster than he realized, and every attempt to regain it only made things worse. Jason monitored it all from the shadows. Every flinch, every frustrated sigh, every snap of a pen in Mark's office fueled his resolve. Months of humiliation, betrayal, and meticulous planning were converging into this precise moment. Late one night, Jason sat alone in his apartment, reviewing the final numbers. The network of control he had built was nearly complete. The company's fate was about to shift irreversibly, and Mark would be left powerless to stop it. Jason allowed himself a slow, almost imperceptible smile. The storm he had quietly built over the past year was about to hit. Jason's plan was entering its most delicate phase. Every move had to be precise, every word carefully chosen. He spent hours analyzing Mark's daily routines, reading between the lines of financial reports, and predicting how Mark would react to even the smallest shift in power. One morning, Jason received confirmation that a major client, one Mark had always considered untouchable, was ready to negotiate directly with him. His pulse raced, but he remained calm. Every gesture, every sentence, every email had to feel casual, harmless, invisible. Meanwhile, Mark was becoming increasingly paranoid. He questioned his employees constantly, demanded unnecessary meetings, and even started micromanaging projects he had never touched before. But the more he tried to regain control, the more he lost it. Every misstep amplified the cracks Jason had planted long ago. Jason began leveraging smaller alliances within the company, quietly gaining the trust of mid-level managers and key staff members who had grown frustrated with Mark's arrogance and favoritism. Each meeting, each casual conversation, subtly reinforced Jason's credibility and Mark's isolation. The psychological pressure on Mark was palpable. He felt it in every glance, every phone call that didn't go as expected, every unexpected client inquiry. Panic crept into his thoughts, though he refused to admit it out loud. Jason, watching from the sidelines, allowed himself a small, controlled smile. This wasn't about rushing or brute force, it was about strategy, patience, and letting Mark unravel on his own. And now, everything was coming together. The pieces were aligning, and the moment he had waited for, the moment when Mark would realize the true scope of what was happening, was just around the corner. Jason decided it was time to push harder. The groundwork had been laid, the alliances built, and Mark's overconfidence had left him blind. One by one, Jason began moving the key pieces that would tip the balance irreversibly in his favor. He scheduled meetings with major investors under the guise of strategic consultations. Each conversation was carefully constructed, highlighting opportunities Mark had ignored, subtly pointing out flaws in Mark's judgment, and demonstrating how Jason could manage the company more efficiently. The investors listened intently, intrigued by the clarity and insight Jason presented. At the same time, Jason strengthened ties with Mark's most loyal clients. Through personalized communication and meticulous attention, he offered them stability, reliability, and results, things Mark had taken for granted. Slowly, silently, the loyalty of Mark's empire was shifting without him noticing. Mark's behavior grew erratic. He yelled at assistants, demanded explanations from managers, and micromanaged every project in desperation. The cracks he had once ignored were now impossible to overlook. His confidence, once unshakable, was crumbling. Jason observed all of this from the sidelines, calm, collected, and focused. He could almost feel the tension radiating from Mark, smell the fear hidden beneath his forced bravado. Every step, every misstep by Mark, was a confirmation that patience and strategy were more powerful than raw anger. The final pieces were almost in place. One move away, and everything Mark had built would start to fall into Jason's hands. The anticipation was intoxicating. Jason allowed himself a brief, controlled smile, knowing that soon, all the humiliation, betrayal, and injustice he had endured would be reversed in the most satisfying way possible. The tension had reached a boiling point. Jason had everything in place, investors intrigued, clients shifting loyalty, and key staff quietly supporting him, but the final moves had to be precise. One wrong step, one hint of impatience, and the entire plan could unravel. Jason began coordinating a secret acquisition strategy. Through intermediaries and shell entities, he started quietly purchasing stakes in Mark's company. Every transaction was carefully structured to avoid detection, every move calculated to increase his control without alerting Mark. Meanwhile, Mark's panic was becoming visible. He stormed through the office, barking orders that went ignored or executed poorly. Calls from clients and investors went unanswered. He was losing control faster than he realized, and every attempt to regain it only made things worse. Jason monitored it all from the shadows. Every flinch, every frustrated sigh, every snap of a pen in Mark's office fueled his resolve. Months of humiliation, betrayal, and meticulous planning were converging into this precise moment. Late one night, Jason sat alone in his apartment, reviewing the final numbers. The network of control he had built was nearly complete. The company's fate was about to shift irreversibly, and Mark would be left powerless to stop it. Jason allowed himself a slow, almost imperceptible smile. The storm he had quietly built over the past year was about to hit. The first signs of disruption hit Mark's office like a shockwave. Reports started coming in that major clients were reconsidering their contracts, investors were quietly asking questions, and some of his trusted managers were subtly siding with the person they now saw as more competent, Jason. Mark slammed his laptop shut, frustration boiling over. "What is going on?" he shouted, pacing like a caged animal. The staff in the room exchanged nervous glances, none daring to answer directly. Meanwhile, Jason watched everything unfold from a distance, quietly tracking every development. Each lost client, each hesitant investor, each faltering manager was a piece of the puzzle falling exactly where he wanted it. Jason's phone buzzed, a confirmation that another large client had formally committed to his network. He didn't celebrate, he simply noted it, adjusting his plans to account for the new shift in power. Mark, sensing that something was wrong but unable to identify the source, became increasingly erratic. He called urgent meetings, sent urgent emails, and tried to micromanage every aspect of the business, but the network Jason had quietly built was already absorbing the pressure. Every time Mark raised his voice, Jason's allies remained calm, professional, and subtly aligned with Jason's growing influence. The unraveling was silent, invisible to Mark, yet unstoppable. Jason leaned back in his chair, calm, collected, and focused. Every move he had made, every strategy he had employed, was now manifesting in real time. The tension was unbearable for Mark, yet for Jason, it was the culmination of a year-long plan executed with absolute precision. The final pieces were nearly in place. Soon, the man who had humiliated him would be forced to see the consequences of underestimating him, and he wouldn't be able to do a thing to stop it. Jason's plan was now entering its final, most delicate phase. Every client he had quietly secured, every investor subtly swayed, and every alliance carefully nurtured was converging into a single, unstoppable momentum. The moment of irreversible impact was approaching. Mark, oblivious to the full extent of Jason's influence, was spiraling. He stormed through the office, barking orders, checking reports, and demanding updates that seemed to only worsen his anxiety. His confidence, once unshakable, was being chipped away piece by piece. Meanwhile, Jason carefully orchestrated his next move, the first formal announcement to the board of investors under his growing control. He prepared a concise, professional presentation, highlighting opportunities Mark had missed and showcasing the stability and potential of the company under his guidance, without revealing his hand entirely. As the board meeting began, Mark sat at the head of the table, his expression a mask of authority, hiding the panic rising beneath the surface. Jason entered quietly, taking a seat at the far end, and allowed the room to settle. His presence alone was now enough to unsettle Mark. One by one, investors raised questions Mark could barely answer. The cracks in his management style, previously invisible, were now glaring. Every hesitation, every vague answer, reinforced Jason's growing credibility. The tension in the room was palpable. Mark could feel the walls closing in, though he still didn't know who was responsible for the silent, strategic takeover of his empire. Jason listened calmly, contributing only when necessary, each word measured, precise, and impactful. Every subtle suggestion he made seemed to guide the board's thinking, steering the conversation in ways that Mark could neither control nor predict. By the time the meeting ended, a clear shift had taken place. Investors were whispering, nodding, and exchanging glances. Mark left the room exhausted, frustrated, and confused, unaware that the tide had already turned, and that the man he had humiliated months ago was quietly orchestrating the collapse of everything he thought he owned. Jason walked out with calm confidence, knowing the next phase would bring the final confrontation closer, but still keeping his cards close to his chest. The storm was gathering, and Mark was completely unaware that it was about to hit. The fallout began the very next morning. Mark walked into the office expecting control. Instead, he walked into silence. Not the normal busy silence of productivity, but the heavy, watchful kind. Conversation stopped when he passed. Eyes avoided his. The confidence he once commanded was gone. In its place? Doubt. His assistant approached carefully. "Sir, 3 board members requested an emergency review of executive leadership performance." The words hit like a slap. Executive leadership. Mark snapped. "That's me." "Yes, sir." Meanwhile, Jason sat across town in a quiet conference room, reviewing documents with 2 senior investors who had officially shifted their loyalty. No celebration. No arrogance. Just numbers. Percentages. Control. One of the investors leaned forward. "If this continues," he said quietly, "a leadership vote could happen within weeks." Jason didn't smile. He simply nodded. "Then we make sure," he replied calmly, "that when that vote happens, there's no doubt." Back at the company, the cracks widened. A major contract was officially terminated. Another client paused negotiations indefinitely. Stock value dipped slightly, not catastrophic, but enough to trigger internal alarms. Mark's temper exploded. He accused managers of incompetence, threatened restructuring, demanded loyalty. But loyalty cannot survive fear. And fear was all he had left. Jason watched it unfold like a chess master watching the final phase of a game already won in strategy. Every reaction Mark had now was reactive, desperate, predictable. That night, Jason stood in his apartment, staring at the city lights through the window. 1 year ago, he had stood in the snow holding a termination letter. Now, he was holding something far more powerful. Control. And Mark still had no idea how deep this went. The vote wasn't official yet. The takeover wasn't public yet. But the collapse had already begun. And there was no stopping it now. The pressure didn't explode overnight. It tightened. Slowly. Like a rope being pulled 1 inch at a time. Mark could feel it. He just didn't know where it was coming from. The emergency board review was scheduled for Friday morning. 3 days away. 72 hours that would feel like 72 years. Mark hadn't slept properly in weeks, but now the insomnia turned vicious. He lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, replaying numbers in his head, running scenarios, trying to identify the leak. Who was undermining him? Who was feeding doubt into the investors? Who had the access? His mind scanned through every executive, every manager, every partner. But one name never crossed his mind. Jason. Because in Mark's world, Jason was gone. Irrelevant. Disposable. And that was his biggest mistake. Across town, Jason's movements were calm. Measured. Surgical. He wasn't reacting. He was directing. In a private office rented under his consulting firm, he sat with legal advisors reviewing shareholder thresholds. The language of the contract was precise. Once we cross this percentage, the lawyer explained quietly, you can formally request a leadership vote. And with the backing you've secured, it will be difficult for him to survive it. Difficult. Not impossible. Jason didn't deal in difficult. He dealt in certainty. He leaned forward, eyes steady. I don't want difficult, he said calmly. I want inevitable. The next day, another blow hit Mark's company. An internal memo leaked. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was worse. It was factual. It showed declining retention metrics over the last quarter, data that investors had not been fully briefed on. The board demanded clarification. Mark stormed into the analytics department, face red, jaw clenched. Who released this? He demanded. No one answered. Because technically, no one had leaked it. The numbers were real. And the board had the right to request them. Jason had simply ensured the right people asked the right questions. Friday arrived. The boardroom felt colder than usual. Mark entered first, shoulders squared, pretending authority he no longer fully felt. Then the investors arrived. Quiet. Measured. Watching. And then Jason walked in. Not as an employee. Not as a subordinate. But as a stakeholder. Mark's eyes narrowed. For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Recognition. Suspicion. Why are you here? Mark asked, voice tight. Jason adjusted his cufflinks calmly before sitting down. I own a percentage of this company, he replied evenly. I'm entitled to attend. The room went silent. Mark blinked. You, what? Jason slid a document across the table. Not dramatically. Not aggressively. Just matter of fact. A breakdown of shares. Acquisitions. Strategic investments made over the last 6 months. Through subsidiaries. Through aligned investors. Through patients. The air shifted. The board members exchanged looks. Mark's breathing changed. He scanned the document. His face slowly lost color. This is a joke, he muttered. It's audited, one investor replied calmly. Jason didn't smile. He didn't need to. Because the humiliation was already beginning. The meeting intensified. Investors questioned Mark's recent decisions. They referenced the lost contracts. The retention drop. The mismanaged communication strategy. For the first time in his career, Mark didn't have clean answers. He blamed market conditions. He blamed staff. He blamed timing. But the room wasn't buying it. Because sitting quietly at the far end of the table was the man who had solutions for every problem Mark described. Jason spoke only when necessary. And when he did, his voice was calm. Confident. Prepared. We anticipated that shift 3 months ago, he said at one point, sliding another document forward. A proactive diversification strategy would have prevented this decline. Board members nodded. Mark clenched his fists under the table. That was when it hit him. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't market fluctuation. This was design. And suddenly, his mind went back. Christmas Eve. The smirk. The pink slip. The dismissal. He looked up slowly at Jason. You, he whispered. Jason met his eyes. Unblinking. No anger. No visible satisfaction. Just quiet dominance. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The board concluded the session with a formal statement. A leadership performance vote would be held within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Mark walked out of that room shaken. Not publicly. But internally. Because now he knew. He hadn't just been losing business. He had been outplayed. And the man he humiliated was now positioned to take everything. That night, Mark sat alone in his dark office. City lights reflecting off the glass. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar. Fear. Not of losing money. Not of losing status. But of losing control. And somewhere across the city, Jason sat calmly reviewing timelines. The vote was coming. The percentages were secured. The alliances were firm. But he wasn't rushing. He wanted Mark to sit with the realization. To feel the pressure. To understand, slowly, that this wasn't luck. It was consequence. The next move wouldn't be loud. It would be decisive. And once triggered, there would be no turning back. The announcement of the leadership vote changed everything. Not publicly, but internally. The company felt different. Like a battlefield before sunrise. Quiet. Tense. Waiting. Mark moved fast. Too fast. He began calling individual board members privately, attempting damage control. Promises were made. Incentives hinted at. Loyalty questioned. I built this company, he insisted during one late-night call. You can't let an outsider walk in and take control. But the problem was simple. Jason wasn't an outsider anymore. He was a stakeholder. A powerful one. And unlike Mark, he wasn't emotional. He was prepared. Jason's approach was different. He didn't beg for loyalty. He presented vision. Over the next week, he met privately with each major investor. Calm conversations. Clear projections. Detailed restructuring plans. Risk mitigation strategies. He showed them something Mark no longer could. Stability. Control. Growth. In each meeting, he never insulted Mark directly. He didn't need to. The numbers did that for him. Meanwhile, Mark's paranoia turned aggressive. He ordered internal audits. He demanded to see communication logs. He even accused senior managers of betrayal. One executive finally snapped during a heated meeting. You're not listening anymore, she shouted. You're reacting. That's the problem. Mark stared at her like she'd committed treason. But deep down, he knew she was right. Then came the turning point. 3 days before the vote, another major investor publicly aligned with Jason. Not quietly. Not subtly. Publicly. The internal memo circulated within hours. Support for leadership transition, 62%. Mark read the number 3 times. 62. That wasn't uncertainty. That was majority. His hands trembled slightly. For the first time since Christmas Eve, he felt powerless. Jason didn't celebrate. He didn't relax. Instead, he tightened everything. Legal confirmations. Vote procedures. Contingency plans. Because he knew something important. Cornered men are dangerous. And Mark was officially cornered. The night before the vote, Mark requested a private meeting with Jason. Not as a CEO. Not as a superior. But as a man losing control. They met in the same office where Jason had been fired a year ago. The same desk. The same chair. But the power dynamic had shifted entirely. Mark stood near the window, city lights behind him. You've made your point, he said quietly. Jason remained standing. Calm. Silent. What do you want? Mark asked. Jason tilted his head slightly. What do I want? He repeated. Mark's voice cracked just slightly. You're about to take everything. Jason stepped closer to the desk. His voice was steady. 1 year ago, you didn't just fire me. You humiliated me. You laughed. Silence filled the room. You thought I was small, Jason continued. Replaceable. Mark swallowed. This isn't personal, Mark muttered weakly. Jason's eyes hardened for the first time. It was personal to me. The tension in that room could suffocate. Mark tried one last attempt. I can offer you a senior position. Equity. More than you have now. We can fix this. Jason almost smiled. Not amused. But amazed. Even now, Mark didn't understand. This was never about a position, Jason said quietly. It was about control. And for the first time, Mark realized. He wasn't negotiating. He was losing. The vote would happen in 12 hours. The boardroom was ready. The documents prepared. The percentages locked. But nothing had been finalized yet. The final moment was approaching. And once it happened, there would be no undoing it. The boardroom was colder than usual. Not physically. Emotionally. Long polished table. 12 chairs. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking the city. The same room where strategies were built. And now, where power would shift. One by one, board members entered. No small talk. No smiles. Just quiet nods. Folders placed carefully in front of them. Mark arrived last. Suit perfect. Expression controlled. But his eyes betrayed him. He scanned the room. Counting. Calculating. Searching for loyalty in familiar faces. Some avoided his gaze. Some met it, but without warmth. At the far end of the table, Jason Saturday. Calm. Hands folded. No smirk. No arrogance. Just stillness. The chairman cleared his throat. We are here to conduct a formal leadership confidence vote regarding the position of CEO. The words echoed heavier than expected. Mark leaned back in his chair, attempting composure. This is unnecessary, he said smoothly. Temporary volatility doesn't justify instability. Jason didn't react. The chairman continued. Each member will cast their vote confidentially. Majority determines outcome. A stack of ballots was placed at the center. One by one. They voted. No speeches. No dramatic declarations. Just paper sliding across wood. Mark's fingers tapped against the table. Slow at first. Then faster. Jason remained motionless. Watching. Reading micro-expressions. Understanding everything without speaking. The final ballot was placed. The chairman gathered them. Silence swallowed the room. You could hear the faint hum of the building's air system. Mark's jaw tightened. This was the moment. The chairman began counting. Quietly. Lips moving. Eyes scanning. Then, he paused. Just for half a second. But long enough to be noticed. Mark felt it. Jason saw it. The room shifted. The chairman finished. He placed the stack down carefully. Cleared his throat again. The board has reached a decision. Mark straightened. Jason didn't move. The vote of confidence for current CEO, a beat, has not passed. The words hit like a controlled explosion. Not loud, but devastating. Mark's face didn't fall immediately. It froze. Like his brain refused to process what it had just heard. The chairman continued. Effective immediately, the board appoints interim executive authority pending formal transition. All eyes slowly turned. To Jason. Mark finally spoke. This is a mistake. But it didn't sound powerful. It sounded thin. One board member spoke gently. It's not personal, Mark. But everyone in that room knew. It was. Jason finally stood. Not triumphantly. Not aggressively. Just slowly. Measured. He walked around the table. Stopped across from Mark. The same distance. The same dynamic. Reversed. You built something strong, Jason said quietly. Mark looked up at him. Anger. Shock. Humiliation. You destroyed it, Mark whispered. Jason's expression didn't change. No, he replied calmly. You did. Security had already been notified for protocol. Not dramatic. Not aggressive. Just procedure. Mark stood. For a moment, it looked like he might argue. Fight. Explode. But then something inside him cracked. He picked up his phone. His folder. And walked toward the door. Halfway there, he stopped. Without turning around, he said. You think this ends here? Jason's voice was steady. It already did. Mark left. The door closed softly behind him. No applause. No celebration. Just quiet realization. Power had shifted. Completely. Jason turned to the board. This company doesn't need revenge, he said calmly. It needs rebuilding. And for the first time, they didn't see the employee who was fired. They saw the leader who survived. But this is not the ending. Because power brings enemies. And humiliation breeds retaliation. Mark may have lost the chair. But he still has connections. Still has pride. Still has something to prove. And people like Mark don't disappear quietly. Mark didn't go home. He didn't call friends. He didn't explode. He drove. No destination. Just motion. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned pale. He replayed the vote in his head. The pause. The faces. Jason standing. That calm look. That calm look hurt the most. Because it wasn't victory. It was inevitability. And Mark hated inevitability. By midnight, he wasn't angry anymore. He was thinking. And that was far more dangerous. He pulled into a private parking garage downtown and made a call. Not to a board member. Not to an employee. To someone else. A name rarely mentioned publicly. A silent investor. A man who valued power more than stability. When the call connected, Mark's voice was controlled. They replaced me. A pause. Then a low chuckle from the other end. I heard. Mark stared at the dark windshield. He thinks he won. Another pause. Did he? The voice asked. Mark's jaw tightened. No. Meanwhile, at the company, Jason stepped into the CEO office for the first time. The same office where he had once stood holding a termination letter. He didn't sit immediately. He walked slowly around the room. Observing. Understanding. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was responsibility. His phone buzzed. Legal updates. Transition paperwork. Press inquiry drafts. But one message stood out. From IT security. Unusual external data access attempt detected 2247. Jason stopped walking. Read it again. Unusual access. From a server that only former executive credentials could reach. Mark. Jason's expression didn't change. But something sharpened behind his eyes. So that's how it begins. Back in the parking garage, Mark made another call. This one shorter. I need copies of everything. Client files. Internal projections. Private communications. A pause. Then, you don't work there anymore. Mark's voice turned ice cold. I still know where the weaknesses are. He ended the call. Looked up at the concrete ceiling. Jason thought he had won control of the company. But control could be damaged. Reputation could be attacked. Investors could be frightened. Clients could be spooked. And doubt? Doubt spreads faster than truth. The next morning, financial media exploded with a headline. Internal instability after sudden CEO removal. Anonymous sources claimed leadership conflict. Strategic disagreements. Future uncertainty. Stock dipped. Not catastrophic. But noticeable. Jason read the article quietly. He didn't need proof. He knew the source. Mark wasn't attacking directly. He was destabilizing. Slowly. Strategically. Emotionally. By afternoon, 2 mid-level executives requested clarification meetings. One investor asked for reassurance. A key client postponed signing a renewal contract. The seeds were working. Jason called an emergency strategy meeting. No panic. No blame. Just structure. He stood at the head of the table. Someone wants instability, he said calmly. We respond with transparency. Not defense. Not retaliation. Transparency. Numbers were presented. Transition plans clarified. Growth projections reinforced. Confidence rebuilt. But Jason knew something deeper. This wasn't about business anymore. This was psychological warfare. Mark wasn't trying to reclaim the chair. He was trying to make it impossible for Jason to sit in it peacefully. That evening, Jason received a private message. Unknown number. Just one sentence. You think this ends here? Jason stared at it. Same words Mark had said in the boardroom. Slowly, Jason typed a reply. Then stopped. Deleted it. No reaction. That was the real power. But even as he placed the phone down, he understood something clearly. Mark had lost position. Not ambition. And now, the battle wasn't corporate. It was personal. And somewhere in the city, Mark sat in a quiet office that didn't belong to him anymore. Watching market movements. Watching media headlines. Waiting for cracks to widen. Because he believed something dangerous. If he couldn't control the company, he could make sure no one else could either. 3 days after the media leak, the real attack came. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't anonymous. It was legal. A lawsuit was filed against the company. Filed by a newly formed investment group. Allegations. Breach of fiduciary duty during leadership transition. Manipulation of board influence. Unethical acquisition of controlling shares. The media didn't hesitate. Hostile power grab? Was the CEO vote clean? Is the new leadership legitimate? Jason read every headline. Calm. Silent. But inside, calculating. Because this wasn't random. The investment group traced back to one quiet investor. The same one Mark had called that night. Mark had found leverage. If the court froze the transition, Jason's authority would stall. Investors would hesitate. Clients would retreat. Confidence would fracture. And in business, perception is reality. But the legal attack wasn't the worst part. The betrayal was. Late that evening, Jason's chief operations officer requested a private meeting. A man Jason had trusted. Worked with closely. Shared strategy with. The door closed. The room felt heavier than usual. I need to tell you something, the COO said. Jason didn't interrupt. Mark approached me 2 weeks ago. Silence. He offered equity. Protection. A guaranteed position if he regained influence. Jason's expression didn't change. And, he asked quietly. The COO swallowed. I gave him internal projections. The words landed clean. Sharp. Controlled. Not dramatic. Just devastating. The media leak. The timing. The investor lawsuit. It all aligned. Jason leaned back slowly. Why tell me now? The COO looked down. Because he doesn't want the company back. Jason's eyes narrowed slightly. He wants you to fail. Silence filled the room. The COO continued. He said if he couldn't sit in that chair, no one would. Jason stood. Walked toward the window. City lights reflecting in the glass. 1 year ago, he stood outside in the snow, holding a termination letter. Now he stood inside the office that once rejected him. And he understood something powerful. This was never about revenge. Revenge was emotional. This was about legacy. And Mark was still fighting emotionally. Which meant? He was already losing. The next 48 hours were surgical. Jason's legal team moved immediately. Every share acquisition was documented. Every vote recorded. Every communication preserved. Transparency became a weapon. Then came the counterstrike. Not loud. Not aggressive. Precise. Jason's team uncovered something buried in old financial audits. A series of high-risk executive decisions made under Mark's leadership. Not illegal, but undisclosed. Decisions that put the company at severe exposure during prior quarters. If brought into court, it wouldn't look like leadership. It would look like negligence. Jason didn't rush it. He waited. Then he requested a private meeting with Mark. Neutral location. Private conference room. No cameras. No board members. Just the two of them. Again. Full circle. Mark entered confident. Controlled. "You're under pressure," he said smoothly. "This lawsuit won't disappear." Jason slid a folder across the table. "Neither will this." Mark opened it. His expression changed slowly. Not panic. Recognition. Jason spoke calmly. "I won't use this publicly." Mark looked up. "You'd destroy the company's image." Jason nodded slightly. "And yours." Silence. Jason leaned forward. "You want me to fail? That's clear. But if this continues, it won't be my fault that headlines remember." Mark's jaw tightened. Jason continued. "Withdraw the lawsuit. Publicly acknowledge the transition. End the media manipulation." Mark stared at him. "You think this scares me?" Jason's voice lowered. "No. I think exhaustion does." A long pause. "You've already lost the chair," Jason said quietly. "You don't have to lose your legacy." The room went silent. Not hostile. Just heavy. Mark looked at the documents again. He wasn't stupid. He knew what they meant. Court discovery would expose everything. The lawsuit would backfire. Investors would abandon him permanently. And worst of all, he would become irrelevant. For the first time since the vote, Mark looked tired. Not angry. Not aggressive. Just tired. "You were supposed to disappear," he said quietly. Jason held his gaze. "I almost did." Another long silence. Then, Mark closed the folder. 2 days later, the lawsuit was withdrawn. A public statement followed. "After careful review, I acknowledge the board's decision and wish the company future success." Media shifted tone immediately. Stock stabilized. Clients returned. Confidence rebuilt. And this time, it was solid. Months later, the company was stronger. Not because of aggression, but because of clarity. Jason stood once more in the CEO office. But now, he sat in the chair. Comfortably. Not as revenge. Not as proof. But as responsibility. He looked out at the city lights again. The same lights that once watched him walk away in humiliation. Now they reflected differently. He didn't hate Mark. He didn't celebrate defeating him. Because the real victory wasn't taking someone down. It was refusing to become them. Jason didn't win because he attacked harder. He won because he endured longer. Because he thought deeper. Because he controlled himself when others lost control. Power gained through ego collapses. Power built through patience lasts. And that was the final difference between them. Mark wanted dominance. Jason built stability. Mark fought to destroy. Jason chose to rebuild. And in the end, the chair didn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belonged to the calmest mind.